It's the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glowinski.
So thinking about it, how many pedants do you know in your life? You know, there's people that are just obsessed with tiny details, complete accuracy, and then shoving it down your throat if you're not sure, how flexible to be. And what about you? Are you one of those people? Are you that pedant? Well, it's been something that's been going on throughout history, throughout cultures of all times and places. And joining me right now is Arnoud Visser, who's actually written a book about this very topic. Arnoud, hello. Thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very well. It's cold and dark outside, but it's lively inside here in Amsterdam because it's St. Nicholas Eve. There's a Spanish connection.
Lovely.
Presents for children.
Oh, well, I really appreciate even more that you're joining us to talk about this topic. Hopefully you'll get outside and be able to have some fun very, very shortly. But what drew you to this topic? Is it something that you feel yourself personally identifies with? Because you know what? I'm trying to catch you out. I'm like sussing you out here as well. I'm like, is he one of those?
Spotted. Well spotted. Well, actually, I think there is that element to it, but more generally, I think I find it fascinating to see how knowledge can create hostility or irritation, even though we also appreciate learning and knowledge in many ways. So we want everyone to have a good education, but if you show it too much, if you show your learning too much, it can easily become very irritating, annoying.
That's such a good point, actually. You know, we're all consumers of information. We want accuracy. You know, if you're consuming information that tells you, you know, you need to be at this place at this time for this event starting or whatever, and it's wrong, it's really annoying. But why is it that the extreme of that is also annoying? You know, someone's like, no, but it's at 7:35, not at 7:30. Then you're just like, oh, well, who cares? Why is that line there?
I think there's generally three issues that make something annoying to people. It can either be the language that people use, difficult words, obscure words, pretentious words, foreign language words. It is the behavior that is behind certain displays of knowledge, interrupting, correcting, that sort of thing. And it can be the type of knowledge. Today, we often associate pedantry or pedants with grammar. But in the past, also other kinds of learning, can be philosophical learning or classical learning, were getting under people's skin.
Yeah, and actually we're going to definitely go into some of those characters that you've talked about in the past, but I'm going to pick up on that point just there that you said about grammar and being precise about grammar, because I see it on the internet all the time. People are having an argument about, I don't know, immigration, you know, a big emotional topic. And then all of a sudden it just descends in, well, your opinion doesn't count because you didn't put a comma or an apostrophe in the right place. You see that all the time in modern arguments. It kind of takes away from the actual argument. What's that all about? What's going on there?
Well, I think the people who find that annoying feel not heard. They have the idea that they are not listened to on the level of arguments, but more on the level of formal aspects. Whereas I think the people who are accused of pedantry, the people who correct, have the idea that there's a lack of standards, there's a lack of accuracy, a lack of precision. So there's two sides that don't understand each other. And then there's the charge of being a grammar Nazi or grammar police that tries to capitalize on that on that misunderstanding. In this case, from the part of those who feel unheard.
And so your stand of this is that it's two different ways of thinking that just don't align, as opposed to a distraction technique, or, I'm losing the argument, so I'm going to go somewhere else with this.
Well, from the point of pedantry, I think people who are accused of it hardly ever think themselves that they are engaging in pedantry. They often, it's an accusation that you receive. It's not something that people pride themselves on, only in a few exceptional cases, but it's usually as a joke. So it's a weapon to accuse people of pedantry if you think that their arguments are not valid. So in the case of this, the example that you mentioned, it's an example, I think, where people feel that they are not listened to on the level of the arguments, on the level of the content, and they get criticism on the formal aspect of how they use their language.
Wow, that's so interesting, because you're almost saying that calling someone a pedant is a weapon, whereas I might almost say that calling someone out on an apostrophe is not the point, and you're using it as a weapon. You know, you're using it to try and make the other person feel stupid, and it's quite insulting. And again, it's not about the actual topic.
Absolutely. I think that's certainly also true. I just try to explain the mechanism of what happens when people use this word, when people get annoyed by a display of knowledge that in itself, if you look at it from a distance, may also have its own value. It may be helpful to know, in some cases, how to express yourself according to the general rules of how language works. I don't want to defend, in this case, the party of the pedants, basically, but just to explain that can have its own use. And people do find that relevant when the children are educated at schools, that they know how to write and how to read. But in other contexts, they don't want to be bothered by this type of argument if they are talking about something else. I think that's what happens in this particular case. When the irritation is appearing,
yeah, it's so interesting because it's so emotive. You know, ultimately it's a small thing, but actually, you can even just feel your heart rate racing when you're thinking about it. So let's go into some of the research that you did in your book. You know, you investigated some of these more well-known cultural figures throughout history. Tell us about a couple of them.
Yeah, well, what I think, what drove me was to look at the patterns that are behind these irritations about knowledge, about learning, and that starts a long way back. You can see actually a long history of irritation about knowledge, even at those who we now think are venerable intellectuals, such as Socrates. And we know that Socrates was, of course, condemned to death and was executed by the state for basically being extremely annoying, asking all sorts of irritating questions, getting under people's skin.
Wow.
That's where the story already started. In his days, there were also other intellectuals who created a lot of irritation, the sophists. And from then on, you can actually trace a continuous history of intellectuals, let's call it like that, people who lead a life of the mind, can be teachers, can be all sorts of different fields of scholarship behind it, who attracted irritation. So in antiquity, but also in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and also in the democratic world. Of course, we now know this debate all too well.
And how did you conduct your research? You know, because I guess you're having to read between the lines. No one else has already done this research in the past for you to then just regurgitate. You're having to work out interactions between different people from thousands of years ago. How did you keep your information correct?
Yes. Well, as a historian, I'm used to looking at sources, and I'm particularly interested in literary sources, so textual sources. So we have all sorts of different genres that can give us an idea of how people responded to these annoying intellectuals. Comedy, for instance, has a long tradition of satire and making fun of people who they thought had deserved to be taught a lesson in their turn, right? So for antiquity, you have many comedies that shed light on how people saw, how the audience looked at these schoolmasterly types. There's also sermons, pamphlets, all sorts of different types of literature that give you an impression of conflicts among scholars, but also of people who were irritated by these schoolmasterly types.
And how were your emotions affected whilst you were writing this book and discovering these characters? Was there anybody that you thought, they're really annoying? Or did you feel like there were some people that were really misunderstood and you felt bad for them?
Well, I think in the case of Socrates, even now, if I read Plato's dialogues with students in different contexts, usually in English translation, some students actually find Socrates really annoying because he has this modest attitude, but you feel underneath that he knows that the other is wrong, and that can still create a sort of irritation. Even though we also like him for his wisdom. If you look at the style that can still be irritating. There are also tragic pedants. The first heretic to be ever burnt at the stake around the year 1000 was Wilgard, and he was actually a teacher of grammar, and he was condemned for being overly enthusiastic about the classics. So you can see that there was a real danger in being too eager, in this case, on classical learning. There's also cases of women who were accused of being annoying for their use of knowledge. For instance, in Paris in the 17th century, in the salons, women were the ones who organized these parties, and they really wanted to have a refined culture and also valued refined words. And they decided at a certain moment to cancel certain words that they thought were too rude. And they were satirized also in comedies for being overly refined and overly fussy in their use of language.
And tracking the pedants throughout history, have you seen that it's just consistent throughout time that people have had the same amount of intolerance? Is it something innately human, or does culture inform how much tolerance we have for pedants or not?
Both, I'm afraid. So there's both elements. So on the one hand, you can see a consistent pattern of irritation, but who is irritated at what differs per cultural context. An interesting indication in this case is to look at the role of men, because pedants are mostly men. And that has to do with the fact
I know this.
You knew all along, of course. But the history of the mansplainer, this is basically. But a long history of that as well. It has to do, of course, with that the world of education was to a large extent only open to men, and that also the values surrounding good use and good conduct with knowledge were measured by how it was to be a good man. And I think it's very helpful to know in this particular context that the whole word for virtue, virtus, meant manliness. Vir is man in Latin, and so it means to be virtuous means to be manly. And that means that if people were criticized in their use of knowledge, they could be criticized for either having a lack of manliness, being effeminate, and you see that at several times, also in the 20th century, politicians who were not manly enough, too intellectual, but also the other way around, of being overly manly, boorish and boors, what you see in the context of the salons, or in between, being sexless, having no manliness, being dead from the waist down. In Victorian England, for instance, was this expression of scholars who were dry. So that I think is a very interesting pattern of the cultural specificity of the pedantry.
And has language changed around pedantry in today's world as well? You know, autism spectrum, I'm thinking of people on that spectrum that more and more you see in the media, people are saying, this amazing famous person who's achieved this, that and the other is perhaps autistic, or they're on the spectrum there. And that's often related with pedantry. Is that just a new language, a new terminology that we've got for classifying different types of behaviour? Has anything changed there?
That is fascinating. I think what I see from a historical perspective is that things add to the repertoire of ways of looking at this. So there's a long history with, in many ways, language that dates back from ages ago that we still use. For instance, when it concerns sophistic or sophisticated, academic can be both wrong and right. Those are all ancient terms and also ancient stereotypes that we still use of shabby scholars, all those otherworldly scholars. But new things are added to this repertoire of thinking about the vices of learning. And the example that you mentioned from the realm of psychology is one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And, social skills as well, different social learning, where you fit into that bracket. Do you have a message in this book? Is it just something interesting, or is it something that you want people to read and self-reflect on or judge other people from?
Yeah, no, I think history doesn't normally teach easy lessons, but can make us wiser, I think. And I think especially in a time when we are very often concerned about anti-intellectual sentiments that are very much tied to this world, the populist discourse. It's helpful to look back and to see that there is a history to this phenomenon, a much longer history. And what I want to do in my book is basically offer two mirrors to those who feel a bit inclined to pedantic behavior every now and then, to be more aware of what can trigger this irritation, that it's not usually your ideas, but it's more about the behavior, and that irritation in itself is not a sign that you're right, what is often thought among certain intellectuals. And to the other side of those people who like to be irritated, who relish in the irritation against pedantry, it's perhaps also useful to reflect a bit what triggers this irritation, and is this really as evil as other vices such as cruelty or corruption? Why are we so easily inclined? It may be a bit of a pet irritation, a pet peeve, to be bothered by pedants. Whereas I think it can also challenge us in certain ways. People who have expertise, who have knowledge, can also challenge us to learn, and we may accept this learning in other contexts. For instance, if we work out in the gym, we don't mind to be challenged. But when it comes to ideas, when it comes to knowledge, we quickly find that more irritating. And I think it will be helpful to look at the history of this, to reflect a bit on it.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. It's definitely got me thinking, for sure. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and sharing your experience. The book is called On Pedantry, A Cultural History of the Know-It-All. It's by Arnoud Visser, and you can find it on Amazon or the Talk Radio Europe bookshop. Arnoud, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you.